The archaeologist's trowel scraped against something hard. Not stone. Bone. She brushed away dirt carefully, revealing a skull. Then another skull. Then a rib cage. Then a pelvis. Then tiny finger bones from a child's hand. She kept brushing and the bones kept appearing. 10 skeletons. 20. 50. 100. The excavation in Nuremberg, Germany in 2024 had uncovered something unprecedented. 8 mass graves containing over 1,500 bodies from medieval plague outbreaks. The largest plague burial site ever discovered in Europe. And the bones, preserved perfectly in the German soil for 6 centuries, were about to reveal secrets that would rewrite what we know about the Black Death. This isn't ancient history disconnected from modern life. This is forensic archaeology conducted with the same DNA analysis, radiocarbon dating, and skeletal pathology techniques used to solve modern crimes. This is CSI, Medieval Edition. And what the bones revealed is more horrifying than any historical text because bones don't lie. Bones preserve evidence that chronicles can't record. Bones reveal how people lived, how they suffered, how they died. The 1,500 bodies in Nuremberg's mass graves are telling us their stories. Stories of pain, terror, family bonds, desperate survival attempts, and mass death on a scale that still shocks researchers who've spent careers studying plague. Before we go through what the bones revealed, and trust me, we're going forensic detail by forensic detail, skeleton by skeleton, discovery by discovery. Comment where you're from. Because similar mass graves probably exist under your city. Medieval plague killed 50 million Europeans. Most were buried in mass graves that remain undiscovered. Construction workers in London, Paris, Florence, Barcelona have all accidentally excavated plague pits while building subway systems or office buildings. Your city might be built on top of a mass grave. You might walk over plague victims every day without knowing. Comment your location. Let's map where mass graves have been found and where they're still waiting to be discovered. The Nuremberg discovery happened by accident in March 2024. The city was excavating for a new office building in the old city center. Archaeologists were monitoring the construction, standard procedure in historic European cities, expecting to find maybe some pottery shards, maybe foundations of medieval buildings, maybe a few individual burials. Instead, they found 8 massive pits, each containing hundreds of skeletons packed so tightly that bodies were stacked in layers 3 to 4 deep. The excavation company in Terra Veritas spent months carefully removing and cataloging every skeleton. They've excavated 3 of the 8 pits completely so far. One contained 280 bodies, another contained 150 bodies, the third contained approximately 300 bodies. 5 pits remain to be excavated. The total count will likely exceed 1,500 bodies, making it the largest plague mass grave ever discovered. But numbers don't capture what the bones revealed. Let's start with the victims' ages. The Nuremberg graves contained adults, adolescents, children, babies, elderly individuals spanning the entire age spectrum. Forensic analysis of skeletal development allows archaeologists to determine age at death with precision. Infant skeletons with unfused skull sutures indicate death before age 2. Child skeletons with partially developed long bones indicate ages 5 to 10. Adolescent skeletons with partially fused growth plates indicate ages 10 to 18. Adult skeletons with fully fused bones but minimal wear indicate ages 20 to 35. Elderly skeletons with severely worn joints and osteoporosis indicate ages over 50. The age distribution revealed something crucial. Plague killed across all age groups, but children died disproportionately. Approximately 40% of the Nuremberg bodies were children under age 15. This matches historical chronicles describing plague as particularly deadly to children and elderly, but having quantitative skeletal evidence makes it visceral and undeniable. 40% means that in a grave containing 300 bodies, 120 were children. 120 children's skeletons stacked in layers, their small bones preserved for 6 centuries, waiting to tell us how they died. The bones revealed how families died together. Several graves contained clusters of skeletons that forensic analysis suggests were family groups buried simultaneously. In one section of the 280-body grave, archaeologists found an adult female skeleton, an adult male skeleton, and 3 child skeletons aged approximately 4, 7, and 10 years buried in a tight cluster. The positioning suggests they were placed in the grave together, probably dying within days of each other, probably from the same plague outbreak, probably a family unit that was erased completely. DNA analysis could confirm genetic relationships but hasn't been completed yet. Even without DNA, the spatial clustering and age distribution make family burials highly probable. This family clustering appears throughout the Nuremberg graves and in other plague mass graves across Europe. The Thornton Abbey grave in England, discovered in 2020, contained 48 skeletons including 27 children. DNA analysis confirmed Yersinia pestis in tooth samples, proving these were plague deaths. The spatial arrangement showed multiple family clusters, adults buried with children in tight groups suggesting familial relationships. The Cambridge mass grave at St. Benet's Church, excavated in 2016 to 2017, showed similar patterns. Plague didn't just kill individuals. It killed families. It killed households. The bones preserve that horror in their spatial relationships. Now let's talk about what killed them. DNA extraction from tooth pulp allows identification of pathogens present at death. Yersinia pestis DNA has been successfully extracted from teeth of bodies in Nuremberg, Thornton Abbey, Cambridge, London Crossrail excavations, and multiple other plague mass graves. The presence of plague bacteria in tooth pulp confirms cause of death and allows genetic analysis of the bacterial strains. Different plague outbreaks involved different strains. The Nuremberg DNA shows the graves contain victims from multiple plague waves, the 1622 outbreak, the 1634 outbreak, possibly earlier outbreaks. Pottery shards and coins in the graves help date specific burial episodes. Silver coins minted in 1619 found in one grave suggest burial around 1620 to 1625. Pottery fragments consistent with early 17th century production in another grave suggest burial around 1630 to 1640. The presence of multiple plague waves in the same burial ground reveals something important. Cities reused mass graves across decades. When plague returned in 1634, Nuremberg authorities reopened the 1622 graves and added new bodies. This reuse explains why some graves show evidence of disturbance. Later burials disrupted earlier burials. It also means the graves contain temporal layers like geological strata, with earlier plague victims at the bottom and later victims at the top. Stratigraphic analysis combined with radiocarbon dating allows archaeologists to distinguish burial episodes and track how plague mortality changed across outbreaks. But DNA and radiocarbon dating only tell us when and what killed them. Skeletal pathology tells us how they lived and how they suffered before death. This is where the bones become truly revelatory. The Nuremberg skeletons show extensive evidence of malnutrition, disease, and physical trauma that predated plague death. Approximately 60% of skeletons show signs of childhood malnutrition, arrested growth lines in long bones, enamel hypoplasia on teeth, skeletal underdevelopment. These markers indicate the victims experienced periods of severe malnutrition during childhood that stunted their growth permanently. Enamel hypoplasia, horizontal grooves in tooth enamel, forms during childhood malnutrition or illness and persists throughout life. The Nuremberg teeth show multiple hypoplastic lines, suggesting repeated episodes of starvation or severe illness during ages 2 to 8. This wasn't unusual for medieval children. Famine was common. Food security was poor. Children routinely experienced malnutrition that modern developed world children never experience. But seeing it preserved in skeletal evidence makes it undeniable. These children starved repeatedly before plague killed them. The adult skeletons show evidence of brutal physical labor. Approximately 70% show arthritis in shoulders, elbows, knees, degenerative joint disease caused by repetitive heavy labor starting in adolescence. Men's skeletons show particularly severe shoulder arthritis consistent with carrying heavy loads. Women's skeletons show particularly severe knee and hip arthritis consistent with constant kneeling and squatting, probably from textile work, cooking, and agricultural labor. These weren't people doing light work. These were people whose bodies were breaking down from decades of physically demanding labor before plague killed them. Multiple skeletons show healed fractures. One adult male skeleton in the 280 body grave shows a healed femur fracture. The thigh bone was broken and healed with significant deformity indicating the bone set incorrectly. This man walked with a limp for years before plague killed him. Another skeleton shows a healed wrist fracture. Another shows healed ribs. These weren't accidents from falls. These were workplace injuries from construction work, agricultural work, manual labor. Medieval life was dangerous. Bodies broke. Bones healed poorly because medical care was primitive. People lived with chronic pain and disability that modern medicine would easily fix. The bones preserve that suffering. Several skeletons show evidence of tuberculosis, a chronic lung infection that causes characteristic lesions on ribs and vertebrae. One elderly female skeleton shows severe spinal tuberculosis. The vertebrae are partially destroyed and fused, indicating she lived with TB for years before plague killed her. She probably coughed constantly, struggled to breathe, lost weight progressively. Medieval people called it consumption because it consumed the body slowly. She survived consumption for years only to die from plague in days. The irony is preserved in her bones. Now here's what makes this even more horrifying. Comment your answer. If you lived in medieval Europe, working brutal manual labor, malnourished since childhood, suffering chronic diseases, and then plague arrived, would you fight to survive or accept death as relief? Fight or accept? Your answer reveals how you value life under conditions of constant suffering. Medieval people fought to survive because they didn't know any different. But was survival under those conditions actually better than death? The bones raise that question. I want your answer in the comments. The bones also reveal burial practices that tell us how societies responded to mass death. The Nuremberg graves show careful, organized burial. Bodies weren't thrown randomly into pits. They were laid out in rows, often on their backs, sometimes with hands folded, suggesting some attempt to maintain dignity despite mass burial conditions. This contrasts with historical descriptions of plague burials as chaotic disposal of corpses without ceremony. The archaeological evidence shows that even during apocalyptic mortality, some communities maintained burial protocols. However, other graves show more desperate conditions. The Thornton Abbey grave in England shows bodies buried rapidly with minimal arrangement, some on sides, some face down, some overlapping. The excavation director described it as evidence that the community was overwhelmed and struggling to bury the dead as fast as possible. The contrast between Nuremberg's organized rows and Thornton's chaotic piling suggests different community responses to similar mortality rates. Some communities maintained social order despite plague. Others collapsed into chaos. The bones reveal clothing and personal items through textile fragments and artifacts preserved in the graves. Several Nuremberg skeletons show traces of woolen clothing, fragments of fabric preserved by contact with metal buckles or buttons. This tells us the dead were buried clothed, not stripped naked, suggesting families retained enough resources and social cohesion to dress their dead properly. Some skeletons wear leather belts with metal buckles. Some wear metal rings on finger bones. One skeleton wears a simple silver crucifix on a chain around the neck bones. These personal items weren't valuable enough to loot from corpses, suggesting burial teams either respected the dead or feared contamination from handling plague victims' possessions. The presence of children's toys in some graves is particularly haunting. One child skeleton aged approximately 6 years was buried with a small carved wooden doll placed next to the hand bones. The doll survived 6 centuries because anaerobic soil conditions prevented decay. This child was buried with care by someone, probably parents, who wanted to provide comfort even in death. That small detail humanizes what could otherwise be abstract skeletal data. This was a specific 6-year-old girl who played with a specific wooden doll and whose parents loved her enough to bury the doll with her. Her skeleton preserves that individual story within the mass graves' collective tragedy. Let's compare multiple mass graves to understand regional variations in plague mortality and burial. The Nuremberg graves, 500+ bodies, represent a major urban center with population around 40,000 in the 17th century. Mortality of 1,500 from plague represents approximately 4% of the population buried in emergency graves. Significant but not civilizational collapse. The Thornton Abbey grave, 48 bodies, represents a rural monastery and surrounding village with population perhaps 200 to 300. Mortality of 48 represents 16 to 24%, devastating for a small community. The Cambridge St. Benet's grave, exact number not disclosed but described as large trench, represents an urban parish dealing with overflow from normal burial capacity. The London Crossrail graves, 25 bodies, represent emergency burials in the East Smithfield Cemetery, historically documented as opened specifically for plague victims in 1348 to 1349. The variations tell us that plague mortality was geographically uneven. Urban centers like Nuremberg could absorb high absolute mortality without complete social collapse because larger populations provided deeper labor reserves. Rural communities like Thornton experienced proportionally higher mortality that devastated local economies and social structures. Monasteries were particularly vulnerable because communal living facilitated transmission. The Thornton Abbey grave contained monks and local lay people, suggesting the monastery served as a hospital that became an infection site. DNA analysis across multiple graves reveals variations in plague strains. The Nuremberg plague was likely bubonic plague based on preservation of lymph nodes in some skeletons showing enlargement characteristic of buboes. The Thornton Abbey plague was confirmed as bubonic through Yersinia pestis DNA extraction. The London Crossrail plague, dated to 1348 to 1349, represents the first plague wave, the Black Death proper, and DNA analysis shows the bacterial strain matches Central Asian strains, confirming the disease's Eastern origin. Later plague waves involved slightly different strains as the bacterium evolved, but all remained highly lethal. Forensic reconstruction of faces from skulls allows visualization of individual victims. Several Nuremberg skulls have been selected for facial reconstruction using clay modeling over skull casts. The reconstructions show ordinary medieval faces, men with worn features suggesting hard lives, women with strong jaws suggesting tough chewing from coarse diets, children with the innocent features children always have. These reconstructions will be displayed in Nuremberg's museums, putting faces to the skeletal remains and personalizing the mass graves victims. One reconstruction shows a woman aged approximately 35 with evidence of healed facial fractures suggesting domestic violence or accident. Another shows a man aged approximately 45 with severe tooth wear suggesting decades of eating gritty bread that ground down enamel. These weren't historical abstractions. These were people with faces and lives and stories. The bones also reveal post-mortem treatment. Some skeletons show evidence of autopsy or medical examination. Cut marks on bones suggesting investigators opened bodies to determine cause of death. Medieval physicians sometimes performed autopsies during plague outbreaks trying to understand the disease. The cut marks prove that even in crisis, some communities maintained medical investigation and scientific curiosity. One Nuremberg skeleton shows evidence of trepanation, a hole drilled in the skull, probably attempting to relieve pressure or release evil humors, according to medieval medical theory. The trepanation occurred peri-mortem, around time of death, suggesting a desperate medical intervention that obviously failed. Now let's talk about what wasn't found in the graves. The absence of evidence is sometimes as important as presence of evidence. The Nuremberg graves contain no high-status burials, no elaborate clothing, no expensive jewelry, no evidence of nobility or wealthy merchants. The buried were working class and poor. This doesn't mean plague spared the wealthy. Contemporary chronicles make clear plague killed across class lines. But wealthy victims received individual burials in family crypts or parish churches, not mass grave disposal. The mass graves contain the people who couldn't afford better, whose families couldn't pay for individual burial, who died without resources or social connections. The bones reveal class stratification persisting even in death. The graves contain minimal grave goods. Medieval Christian burial often included personal items, coins for payment to the dead, pottery vessels for the afterlife journey. The plague graves contain almost nothing, a few coins, occasional pottery fragments, the wooden doll mentioned earlier, virtually no other artifacts. This suggests either rapid burial without ceremony or poverty so severe that families had nothing to bury with the dead. Either interpretation is grim. Either plague overwhelmed burial customs so completely that normal practices were abandoned, or the victims were so poor they owned nothing worth burying. The absence of grave goods reveals either social collapse or endemic poverty or both. The graves contain no evidence of cremation or body processing. All bodies were buried intact. This is significant because some medieval sources describe burning plague corpses to prevent disease spread. The archaeological evidence shows burning wasn't standard practice. Bodies were buried quickly but intact, suggesting communities either didn't believe burning prevented disease or lacked resources, wood, labor, time, to burn corpses. The intact burial preservation is fortunate for archaeologists but tells us medieval plague response didn't include cremation as a systematic practice. Here's the second question I want in comments. If archaeologists excavate your city in 600 years and find a COVID-19 mass grave, assuming COVID had killed at the scale, what would your bones reveal about your life? Hard physical labor or sedentary lifestyle? Well-nourished or diet-related disease? Your skeleton will tell that story. Comment your prediction, because you're living the life that your bones will preserve. The medieval bones reveal brutal labor and malnutrition. What will our bones reveal? Modern forensic techniques allow incredibly detailed analysis that wasn't possible even 20 years ago. Ancient DNA extraction from tooth pulp identifies not just plague but other pathogens present at death. Isotope analysis of tooth enamel and bone collagen reveals diet and geographic origin. Strontium isotopes in tooth enamel reflect the geological signature of water consumed during childhood, allowing determination of whether individuals were local to Nuremberg or migrants. Oxygen isotopes reflect climate of childhood location. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes in bone collagen reflect diet, marine versus terrestrial protein, proportion of meat versus grain in diet, even whether individuals consume significant quantities of specific foods like dairy. Isotope analysis of Nuremberg skeletons reveals most were local to the region, confirming these were community members, not migrants or travelers. Their diet was grain-heavy with minimal meat, approximately 90% of calories from bread, porridge, vegetables, only 10% from meat and dairy. This matches historical understanding of medieval peasant diets, but having isotopic confirmation makes it quantitative rather than qualitative. We can now say precisely that these people ate 90% grain-based diet, not just mostly bread. The precision matters for understanding nutritional stress and vulnerability to disease. Trace element analysis reveals environmental exposure. Lead levels in bones reflect exposure to lead, from pewter dishes, lead-glazed pottery, lead water pipes, lead-based cosmetics. Several Nuremberg skeletons show elevated lead levels suggesting chronic lead exposure. Lead causes neurological damage, behavioral changes, increased mortality. These people were being slowly poisoned by their material culture while simultaneously being malnourished and working brutal labor and suffering chronic diseases, and then plague killed them. The layers of suffering are almost incomprehensible. The bones reveal intergenerational health impacts. Children's skeletons show stunted growth from maternal malnutrition during pregnancy. If a mother is malnourished during pregnancy, the fetus develops poorly, resulting in small birth size and impaired skeletal development visible archaeologically. Several infant skeletons show evidence of intrauterine growth restriction. Bones are smaller than typical for gestational age. These infants were born small because their mothers were starving. Then the infants died from plague within months or years. The bones preserve cycles of poverty and malnutrition spanning generations. Comparison with modern skeletal populations reveals how much human health has improved in developed countries. Average height of medieval adults in the Nuremberg graves is approximately 163 centimeters for males, 152 centimeters for females. Modern German average height is approximately 180 centimeters for males, 166 centimeters for females. That's 17-18 centimeter height increase in 6 centuries, mostly due to improved childhood nutrition. Medieval people were significantly shorter because childhood malnutrition stunted growth. The height difference preserved in skeletal evidence quantifies the improvement in living standards. Medieval dental health was terrible. Approximately 90% of Nuremberg skeletons show cavities, abscesses, severe wear, or tooth loss. One adult male skeleton is missing half his teeth at age 40, probably from abscesses and extractions. Dental disease was endemic because diet was high in carbohydrates, dental care was non-existent, sugar consumption increased in the 17th century, and chronic infections went untreated. Medieval people lived with constant dental pain that would be easily treatable today. The bones preserve that suffering in visible abscesses and bone loss around tooth roots. But here's what surprises researchers. The bones also show resilience. Despite malnutrition, disease, injury, brutal labor, and chronic pain, many individuals survive to ages 40, 50, even 60 in some cases. Life expectancy was low because infant and child mortality was high. Approximately 30 to 40% of children died before age 15. But if you survived to adulthood, you had reasonable chances of reaching 50 or 60 despite horrible living conditions. The bones reveal humans are remarkably resilient organisms capable of surviving conditions that seem incompatible with life. Medieval people endured suffering that would kill modern developed world individuals who lack adaptation to chronic stress. One final call to action. Comment 1500 bodies if you're still reading. And tell me, which archaeological site should I cover next? London Crossrail Plague Graves? Sedlec Czech Republic ossuary containing 40,000 bones? Medieval battlefield mass graves? Comment site plus 1500 bodies, and I'll research the most requested location for a follow-up. The Nuremberg excavation continues. 5 of the 8 graves remain to be excavated. The final body count will likely exceed 1,500, possibly reach 2,000. Each skeleton will be analyzed, catalogued, DNA tested, isotope analyzed, pathology assessed. The bones will reveal names through parish records correlation. Church records list plague deaths, and matching skeletal demographics to recorded deaths might identify specific individuals. Imagine recovering a skeleton, analyzing its pathology, determining it's a male aged approximately 42 who died around 1622, then finding a parish record listing Johann Schmidt, age 42, died of plague June 1622, and being able to say, this skeleton is probably Johann Schmidt. That level of specificity transforms anonymous bones into recovered individuals with identities and histories. What the bones revealed ultimately is that medieval life was suffering punctuated by brief joys and then death from disease. The skeletons preserve evidence of malnutrition, brutal labor, chronic disease, inadequate medical care, environmental toxins, and then plague as the final catastrophe on top of existing misery. These weren't people living idyllic pre-industrial lives. These were people living hard, painful, short lives that we should be grateful we don't have to live. The bones tell us our ancestors suffered so we could inherit a world where antibiotics exist, where food security is normal in developed countries, where child mortality is minimal, where physical labor is optional, where dental care prevents abscesses. But the bones also reveal we're not as far from medieval conditions as we'd like to believe. COVID-19 killed millions in countries with modern medicine. Imagine COVID with medieval medical care. Mortality would have rivaled plague. We're protected by technology and infrastructure that could collapse. If antibiotics fail due to resistance, if food systems fail due to climate change, if medical systems fail due to pandemic overload, we'll find ourselves back in medieval conditions rapidly. The bones remind us that civilization is a thin veneer over biological vulnerability. We're not evolutionarily different from medieval people. We're just temporarily protected by technology. The 1,500 bodies in Nuremberg's mass graves are waiting to tell their complete stories. As excavation continues and analysis deepens, more revelations will emerge. More individuals will be identified. More pathologies will be documented. More evidence of medieval life and death will be recovered. The bones are patient. They've waited 6 centuries. They'll reveal everything eventually to anyone willing to listen. To anyone willing to learn. To anyone willing to understand that we're looking at ourselves. That we're examining the bones of people who were us except for accident of when they were born. That their suffering could be our suffering if circumstances align wrong. That the mass graves could fill again with our bones if pandemic strikes with medieval mortality and we lack resources or social cohesion to respond effectively. The archaeologist set down her trowel after months of excavation. 1,500 skeletons recovered. 1,500 stories revealed. 1,500 individuals who died in agony and were buried in mass graves and forgotten for 6 centuries. Until construction workers' shovels broke through the first grave and bones started appearing. The bones waited patiently to tell their stories. The bones revealed everything. The malnutrition. The disease. The brutal labor. The pain. The suffering. The family bonds. The desperate attempts to maintain dignity in death. The social collapse. The resilience. The endurance. Everything human preserved in calcium and phosphate. The bones don't lie. They only wait. Wait for us to find them. Wait for us to listen. Wait for us to learn. The lesson is simple and terrifying. This happened to them. It could happen to us. The bones reveal we're not special. We're not protected by modernity. We're just temporarily lucky. and luck runs out. The mass graves wait. They always wait, ready to fill again when plague returns, when antibiotics fail, when systems collapse, when we become bones waiting for archaeologists in 2624 to excavate and analyze and wonder how we lived and why we suffered and what killed us. The cycle continues. The bones wait, forever patient, forever revealing, forever teaching that life is suffering and death is mass graves and only archaeology remembers.